valley was quiet, not just peaceful, but the kind of silence that felt like it had swallowed all sound, leaving nothing but the endless stretch of dusty earth and the low hum of a distant wind. Gabriella Matthysse had ridden out early, before the sun had fully risen, knowing that the heat of midday would be unbearable. She needed to think, needed a moment away from the responsibilities of running the ranch, away from the gaze of men who watched her with confusion or suspicion. By the time she reached the small hidden waterfall nestled deep in the hills, the sun had just begun to break over the peaks of the Rockies, casting a soft golden light on the valley below. Gabriella tied her horse to a nearby tree and stood at the edge of the water, listening to the soft, rhythmic sound of it cascading over the rocks. The air smelled of pine and earth, the coolness of the water inviting her to dip her fingers in, to escape the weight that had settled on her shoulders after weeks of work. There was no one else here. The realization filled her chest with a kind of quiet relief. The weight of being constantly watched, constantly judged, lifted for just a moment. She didn't care if the water was cold or if the rocks were slippery. All she cared about was the freedom that came with being alone. Gabriella undressed quickly, peeling off her dusty clothes, the layers of fabric weighing her down with the burdens of expectations. She let them fall into a heap at her feet and stepped into the water, the coldness shocking her skin, but the feeling of release was worth it. She waded deeper, her body slowly adjusting to the chill, until she was fully submerged, letting the water cleanse the exhaustion that had been building in her for months. For a brief moment, she was no one. Not the daughter of a blacksmith, not the capable woman who managed the ranch with an iron fist, and certainly not the one who had learned to carry a weight too heavy for any person to bear. Just Gabriella, in the water, free. It was a rare thing to be free in a world that expected so much from her, and she allowed herself to savor it, floating on her back, eyes closed, the sun warming her face. She was at peace, but then, just as quickly as the peace came, it shattered. A voice, low, strained, unmistakably male. "Miss Matthysse?" Gabriella's heart stopped. She froze, her body tensing as if the very act of moving would somehow make her more visible. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she thought she might have imagined it. She waited, listening to the distant sound of the water, hoping against reason that whoever it was had simply walked by. But no, the voice came again, louder now. Closer. "Miss Matthysse, I didn't mean to intrude." Her skin prickled with heat, but it wasn't from the sun. Her clothes, her bare skin, felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the cold of the water. She turned slowly, keeping her body hidden in the pool, her heart racing. A man stood at the edge of the water, silhouetted by the low light of the morning. He was tall, with the broad shoulders of someone who spent too much time under the sun, and the hands of a man used to working with animals. His hat was pulled low, casting shadows over his face, but she could see the unmistakable outline of his form, strong and steady, like the land itself. And for a moment, she simply stared at him, as if she had never seen a man before, as if the world had turned upside down in a single heartbeat. The cowboy said nothing more. He just stood there, looking at her in silence. His gaze wasn't crude or lascivious. It wasn't the way men usually looked at her, with hunger or disrespect. No, this gaze was different. This gaze was full of something else, something unfamiliar. "Turn around," she said, her voice trembling despite her effort to control it. "I am," he replied quickly. "I swear, Miss Matthysse, I didn't mean—" "Stop talking," she interrupted, her voice shaking with both fury and embarrassment. She grabbed her clothes quickly, pressing them against her chest, as if they could shield her from the weight of his presence. She heard him take a step back, the soft scrape of his boots on stone. "I'll go," he said, his voice low, almost apologetic. "I shouldn't have." "Don't go," Gabriella said before she could stop herself. She didn't know why she said it, or what she expected him to do. She just knew that if he left now, without saying a word, without acknowledging what had just happened, it would be worse. He stopped, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. "I didn't know anyone else knew about this place," he said finally. "I'm sorry." Gabriella's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. "You need to get dressed," he said, his voice firmer now, as if he had finally found his footing in the situation. "I'll wait." And so Gabriella dressed quickly, feeling the heat rise in her cheeks, the weight of the moment settling like a storm cloud overhead. When she finally turned to face him, her clothes back on, the man was still standing by the water, his back to her. But something had shifted in the air between them, something that couldn't be ignored. Gabriella's hands trembled slightly as she buttoned her blouse, each movement slow and deliberate, trying to regain the control she'd lost. The silence between them felt heavy, like a weight she couldn't escape. She wanted to look at him, but the moment was too raw, too awkward, and her body still hummed with a strange mixture of emotions: humiliation, confusion, and something else she couldn't quite name. Once dressed, she finally took a breath and stepped toward him, her boots crunching against the dry earth. She couldn't leave things like this. She couldn't simply pretend he hadn't seen her in a way no one else ever had. The cowboy turned as she approached, his face still guarded, but his eyes were the ones that startled her. They were full of something deeper than mere apology. There was recognition, something she hadn't expected, but it was there, tucked behind the apology, something fierce, something undeniable. He wasn't just a stranger who'd wandered into her solitude by accident. He was a man who had seen her in a way no one else had, and it had changed something between them. "I didn't mean to intrude," he said again, but this time his voice was softer, almost apologetic, as if he wanted to make up for something that could never be undone. "I should have known better." Gabriella's mouth went dry. She wanted to say something cutting, something to push him away, but instead the words got stuck in her throat. It wasn't his fault. He didn't know. He had no idea this place had ever meant anything more to her than just a hiding spot, a place to get away from the noise of life. It wasn't as if she'd been waiting for this moment, for a stranger to find her vulnerable and unguarded. She shook her head, her breath coming quicker than she liked. "You didn't know," she said, her voice quiet, "and I shouldn't have." She stopped herself before she could finish the thought. She shouldn't have what? Taken off her clothes in the first place? Let the weight of the valley and the ranch and the unspoken expectations of everyone in town take her to a place where she could feel nothing but freedom? The cowboy seemed to sense the shift in the air, the tension in her voice. He took a step closer, his hand almost reaching out, but he stopped himself before it made contact. "I'll go," he said, his voice suddenly harder, as if the weight of her discomfort had begun to settle in him too. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble. It's just, this place, it's beautiful. I didn't think anyone else." Gabriella swallowed hard, stopping him with a firm gesture of her hand. Wait. The word was louder than she'd meant, but there was something in her that refused to let him leave just yet. Not like this. "Please." He froze again, but this time his eyes were searching hers, unsure. His shoulders were tense, like he was fighting the urge to bolt. The air between them had shifted, and whatever had existed before, apology, discomfort, simple passing, now felt more like a moment that would be impossible to forget. "I'm not asking you to stay," she said, lowering her voice, trying to steady her racing thoughts. I don't know why I asked you not to leave." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped back a little, giving her some space, but his gaze didn't waver from her. He was waiting for something more, and it hit her then. He wasn't looking for her forgiveness. He wasn't even waiting for some grand gesture of understanding. He was waiting for her to let him go, to give him the permission to walk away without it feeling like something was left unsaid. "I've been here before," he said, his voice low. "Not here exactly, but close. I know what it's like to need a place that's yours, where no one else can touch it." Gabriella blinked, a little surprised by his words. For a brief moment, the world around her seemed to narrow, like she could finally breathe without the weight of everything that came with being the daughter of the blacksmith and the manager of the ranch. She looked at him closely, this cowboy who had stumbled upon her moment of weakness, only to find something more underneath the surface. "You're not the first one to intrude on my solitude," she said quietly. her gaze fixed on the water that still ran relentlessly, as if time had not paused for her. "I thought I had come out here to escape everything, but it's hard to do that when people keep finding me." The cowboy nodded, his lips tightening in understanding. He didn't say anything more, but the way he held himself, this strange mix of respect and wariness, made it clear he wasn't about to push her for answers. He wasn't like other men, who would have made an attempt to explain or apologize more than necessary. No, he was quiet, reserved, as though he respected the silence between them more than any words could. "I'll leave you to it," he finally said, his voice steady again. "I didn't mean to make things difficult." Gabriella watched him take a step back, feeling the quiet pull of the moment, the tension ebbing away. For the first time in what felt like ages, she didn't feel judged, didn't feel like she had to explain herself. The cowboy had seen her at her most vulnerable and offered nothing more than space. There was no expectation of anything from her, but before he could walk away completely, she stopped him again, this time with something in her voice that surprised both of them. "Wait." He turned back, raising an eyebrow, the same intensity in his eyes now softened by something else. Curiosity. He was waiting for her to say whatever it was she needed to say. "You didn't ask for my name," she said, her voice steadying. "I'm Gabriella Matthysse." "And you?" The cowboy looked at her for a long moment, his face unreadable. "Name's Cole," he said, his voice still low but not unkind. "I didn't think you'd want me to stay long enough to introduce myself." Gabriella didn't know why she smiled. Maybe it was the absurdity of the situation. Maybe it was the fact that, for the first time in a long time, someone had found her in a place where she didn't need to be strong, didn't need to be the capable woman who ran the ranch and did the hard work. Here, in the quiet of the hills, she could be just Gabriella. "Well, Cole," she said, her voice softening, "you might be right about that. But for now, you've got a story to tell, and I could use a few more of those." Cole hesitated just for a second before he gave a slight nod. His shoulders, which had been tense and guarded, relaxed a little. He wasn't sure what he expected when he'd come across Gabriella standing in the water, but it certainly wasn't this, an invitation to stay, to talk. It wasn't something he'd been prepared for. In fact, he hadn't been prepared for any of this. "Story?" he asked, raising an eyebrow, a small grin tugging at the corner of his lips, as if the idea of storytelling was some kind of unspoken agreement they'd both unknowingly signed. Gabriella turned slightly to the side, stepping a little closer to the water's edge, the ripples from her movements stilling with the passing moments. "You said you've been here before," she said, her voice soft but firm, "but you didn't say why." For a long moment, Cole stood still, not moving, just watching her. The shadows from the early morning sun stretched long across the hills, and he found himself taking a deep breath, as if whatever was coming next would require a weight he wasn't sure he was ready to bear. "I'm not from around here," he began slowly, as if testing the words before they left his mouth. "But I've been coming to this valley for a while now. I work cattle. Mostly out east, but sometimes further west. I like the quiet of the place. Thought I'd stop by, take a breather." He gave her a look, one that almost seemed apologetic. "Didn't expect to run into anyone." Gabriella nodded, her eyes never leaving the creek. "You're a cattleman?" "Yeah, been doing it most of my life. Grew up in Wyoming." He paused, as if considering how much of his story he wanted to give. "The land's always called to me. Something about the open spaces, the work that never stops. It's—" he let out a sigh and rubbed his jaw. "I don't know, it gets in your blood after a while." "Must be nice," Gabriella murmured, more to herself than to him. "Having a place where the work's enough to keep you busy, not having to worry about anything else." Her words hung in the air between them for a long moment, the water bubbling softly beneath them, its steady sound a reminder of just how still the world felt. Cole sensed there was more she wasn't saying, a kind of weariness that she hid well, but it was there, just beneath the surface. "Not much of a talker, are you?" she said after a while, turning to face him fully now. Her gaze was steady, no longer as guarded as it had been earlier. Maybe it was the way the sun was lighting up the space between them, or maybe it was the fact that, for once, she didn't have to pretend to be something she wasn't. Whatever it was, Gabriella felt more at ease than she had in a long time. Cole let out a small, quiet chuckle. Not much for small talk, no. His voice was rough, but there was a warmth to it that hadn't been there before. It was the kind of warmth you only found in someone who had seen the hard edges of life but still managed to stay grounded. "But I'm listening, if that counts for anything." Gabriella studied him for a moment, her brow furrowed as if trying to figure out what exactly it was about him that put her at ease. He wasn't like the other men she had met in town. He didn't ask her questions about the ranch or the cattle operation, didn't look at her like a curiosity or an opportunity. He wasn't here to gain anything from her. "You've been running cattle for how long?" she asked, curiosity getting the better of her. But there was a deeper question underneath her words, a need to understand why someone would come to a place like this just to be alone. "A long time," Cole replied, his tone quieter now. "But after a while, it starts feeling like running in circles. You think you're getting somewhere, but all you're doing is chasing the horizon." Gabriella tilted her head slightly. "Sounds lonely." "It can be," he paused, then seemed to reconsider. "It's not just the work that makes it lonely, though, it's the quiet. After a while, you start hearing your own thoughts more than you want to, and that can get loud, you know?" She looked down at the water for a moment, processing his words. She knew exactly what he meant. The quiet of the valley wasn't just peaceful. It was heavy, a constant reminder of everything left unsaid, everything left undone. In the silence, she heard the weight of her father's failing health, the unspoken pressures of running a ranch alone, and the loneliness that came with being a woman in a place that expected her to fill 100 roles. "You ever think about stopping?" she asked, her voice low, as if the question was one she'd asked herself 1,000 times and hadn't yet found the answer. "Stopping?" Cole's gaze softened, the corners of his eyes crinkling as he glanced at her. "Not yet, but I reckon I'll think about it someday, maybe." He paused, his expression thoughtful, and Gabriella wondered if he was truly thinking about stopping, or if he was simply trying to convince himself that it wasn't time yet. "You should," she said quietly, her voice carrying a weight of its own. "There's more to life than just the work, you know?" Cole didn't respond right away. Instead, he watched her for a moment, as if weighing her words. Then, he finally nodded, as though seeing something in her he hadn't before. "Maybe you're right." The air between them had shifted. It was no longer just a shared moment of awkwardness or silence, but something deeper. A connection, however brief, had formed in the space of those few words. Gabriella didn't know what it meant, didn't know what it would lead to. But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't alone. "Well," Gabriella said, breaking the silence with a small smile. "I'd offer you a drink, but I don't think either of us is in the mood for that, huh?" Cole chuckled, the sound warm and real. "I don't know. I'm not against a little whiskey with good company." Gabriella raised an eyebrow. "Good company, huh?" "Good company," he repeated, his grin widening just a bit. "I reckon you qualify." There was something about the way he said it, with that slow grin, that made Gabriella feel something flutter in her chest, something she didn't quite understand. But, for now, she pushed it aside, focusing on the easy way their conversation had turned. "Well, maybe next time," she said, her tone teasing. "For now, I think it's best we both head back to where we came from." Cole nodded, tipping his hat toward her. "Guess that's the best idea I've heard all day." And with that, he turned, walking back toward the path, his figure slowly disappearing into the hills. Gabriella stayed by the water for a moment longer, watching the way the sunlight danced across the surface, thinking about the quiet things they hadn't said. But it was enough, she thought. For now, it was enough. The days following Gabriella's encounter with Cole felt strangely lighter. It wasn't as though the weight of the world had suddenly lifted. Her father's health still worsened, the ranch still needed her attention, and the settlement carried its usual grind. But there was a shift, a quiet echo of something unspoken that lingered in the air. Something about Cole's presence, his brief but genuine words, stayed with her longer than she'd expected. She'd returned to her usual routine, but even as she worked, her thoughts kept drifting back to that moment by the waterfall. She wondered where Cole had gone after he left, whether he'd actually gone home or kept riding deeper into the hills. She wondered if he was someone she would ever see again, or if their brief conversation would be just another fleeting encounter, lost in the dusty winds of the valley. The mornings still came too early, the afternoons too hot, and the nights too long. Yet, as the days stretched into another week, something changed in the way Gabriella carried herself. There was less of the tightness in her shoulders, less of the worry that normally haunted her steps. Her routine didn't feel as heavy, though she couldn't quite figure out why. It was on the third day after her meeting with Cole that Gabriella found herself walking toward the saloon, just as the sun was setting. The heat of the day had finally begun to ease, but the night still held the heavy smell of the earth, warm and familiar. She stepped inside, the doors creaking softly as she entered, her eyes immediately scanning the room. The usual crowd of ranchers and farmers were scattered about, their conversations muffled beneath the low hum of the piano in the corner. Then, just as her eyes settled on the bar, she saw him, Cole. He was sitting at the far end, his hat pushed back on his head, a glass of whiskey in front of him, staring into the amber liquid. His presence was steady, like the calm before a storm. But there was a weariness about him, an edge to the way he sat, as if he were waiting for something or someone. Gabriella's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, she wasn't sure what to do. She told herself that their meeting by the waterfall had been a brief, one-time thing, and yet seeing him here, in the saloon where she normally kept to herself, made her feel an unexpected pull. She wasn't sure what it was. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the fact that their brief conversation had left something unsaid between them. Taking a deep breath, Gabriella walked across the room. The noise of the saloon seemed to fade into the background as she approached, her boots clicking softly on the wooden floor. When she reached the bar, she stopped, and for a moment just stood there, uncertain. Cole looked up slowly, his gaze meeting hers with a quiet intensity. The briefest flicker of surprise crossed his features, but it was quickly replaced with that same calm expression he had worn by the waterfall. He didn't say anything right away, just tipped his hat in a quiet greeting, his eyes never leaving hers. Gabriella opened her mouth to say something. She wasn't sure what, but the words wouldn't come. For a brief second, all she could do was stand there, caught in the weight of the moment. "Well, look who decided to join the rest of us," Cole said, his voice low but not unkind. His tone was playful, but there was an undercurrent of something else, something she couldn't quite place. Gabriella raised an eyebrow, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I didn't expect to find you here." He leaned back in his chair, the subtle grin never leaving his face. "Wasn't sure if I'd see you again, but figured this was as good a place as any to wait." Gabriella took a seat beside him at the bar, her pulse quickening slightly, though she couldn't tell if it was from nervousness or something else entirely. The bartender walked over, and she ordered a glass of whiskey, her usual drink, but this time something felt different. She couldn't quite shake the feeling that this was more than just a casual encounter. For a few moments they sat in silence, the low murmur of conversations filling the space around them. Gabriella could feel Cole's gaze on her, but he didn't push her to speak. Instead, he sipped his drink slowly, as if waiting for her to say something first. When she did speak, her voice was quieter than she intended. "I didn't expect you to be in town. I thought you'd be out there, in the hills, chasing the horizon like you said." Cole chuckled, the sound warm but tinged with something heavy. "Maybe I was, but the horizon's a tricky thing. It keeps moving, doesn't it?" Quote. Gabriella nodded slowly, understanding the unspoken truth in his words. "I know the feeling. It's like you keep chasing something, thinking it's just out of reach, but every time you get close, it slips away." "That's the thing about living out here," Cole said, leaning in slightly. "It's always about pushing forward, never looking back." "Is that how you think about it?" Gabriella asked, her voice soft, the curiosity in her tone unguarded. Cole didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared into his drink, swirling the amber liquid slowly in his glass. The light from the lanterns flickered across his face, casting shadows that made him look older than he was, worn by the land he had chosen to work. "I used to think that way," he said finally, "but it's hard to keep running from everything. Sooner or later, it catches up with you." His voice was quieter now, more vulnerable than she had heard it before. Gabriella felt a flicker of understanding stir inside her. He wasn't just talking about land or cattle. He was talking about life. About the things we run from, the things we try to outrun, only to find they've been with us all along. She wanted to ask him more, to understand what he was really saying, but before she could form the question, he spoke again. "I never planned to stop, but after meeting you..." His words trailed off, and he didn't finish the sentence. Gabriella's breath caught in her throat, and she looked at him, her heart hammering in her chest. There was something in his eyes now, something deeper than she had ever expected to see. For a moment, she wasn't sure what to say, but whatever it was, she knew it had to be real. No more hiding, no more pretending. Before either of them could speak again, a shout from across the room broke the moment. "Well, if it ain't Gabriella Matthysse sittin' with a cowboy." The voice was loud and familiar, one of the ranch hands, a man named Frank, who always seemed to be a little too full of whiskey and a little too eager to make trouble. Gabriella's jaw tightened, but she didn't turn away. Instead, she met Cole's gaze, feeling the quiet, unspoken understanding between them. This wasn't just an accident. This was more than that. Cole's expression hardened for a moment, his eyes narrowing at the man's voice. But when he looked back at Gabriella, the warmth returned. He didn't say anything, but his silence spoke volumes. "I guess we'll see how this plays out," he muttered, his voice low, but not without a trace of humor. Gabriella couldn't help but smile. "I think we might." The rest of the evening unfolded with a strange tension in the air. Frank's loud, boisterous remark hung between Gabriella and Cole like a challenge neither of them had been prepared for. But neither of them budged. Gabriella held her ground, staring straight ahead, ignoring the laughter and the whispers that followed Frank's comment. She was used to the scrutiny of others in the settlement, but something about this moment, sitting beside Cole, made the usual discomfort fade into the background. Cole, for his part, didn't flinch. He took another sip of his whiskey, his eyes steady, his posture relaxed. There was something about him, a quiet defiance, a strength that didn't require shouting or posturing. Gabriella couldn't help but admire it. She had never been one to back down, but there was a different kind of power in Cole's calm that made her feel just a little more at ease. Frank and the other men eventually moved on, their laughter fading into the background as they returned to their own conversations, but Gabriella knew that things had changed. The settlement would talk, as it always did, and the gossip would make its rounds. But sitting here with Cole, she didn't care. For the first time in ages, she didn't feel the weight of everyone's expectations pressing on her shoulders. Cole leaned back in his chair and looked at her, his gaze softening. "You know, for someone who's not much for small talk, you sure know how to hold your ground." Gabriella smiled, her lips curling into a half smirk. "I've had plenty of practice," she said, though the truth was, it had never been easy. But in this moment, with Cole beside her, the battle felt lighter. "I don't let people dictate how I live my life." "You don't let anyone dictate anything, do you?" Cole's voice was teasing, but there was a quiet respect beneath it. Gabriella raised an eyebrow. "You're not the first to notice." They both laughed, a sound that felt strange but good, like the release of something they'd both been holding back. The tension that had lingered around them seemed to dissolve in that brief, shared moment, leaving behind something easier, something real. For a while they sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, but not in an uncomfortable way. The hum of the saloon continued around them, the clink of glasses and the shuffle of boots on the wooden floor. But Gabriella found herself focused solely on Cole. She wasn't sure what had changed, but there was something about his presence that made her feel less alone, less like the weight of the world was hers to bear. At some point, Cole finished his drink and set the glass down, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking," he said quietly, "about what you said a while back, by the water." Gabriella looked at him, meeting his gaze. "What part?" "When you said there's more to life than just the work," he said, his voice low. "I've been running cattle my whole life, Gabriella. The land's in my blood. But I never stopped to think about what it was all for." Gabriella felt a stir of something in her chest. It was the kind of honesty she hadn't expected from him, not after their brief meeting. He had always been guarded, reserved, but now there was a vulnerability in his words that made her lean in closer, as if she didn't want to miss anything. "I don't know if I'm ready to stop yet," he continued, his eyes focused on the empty glass in front of him, "but I'm starting to wonder if maybe I've been running from something I'm not ready to face." The weight of his words hung in the air, and Gabriella felt a strange connection to him in that moment. She knew what it was like to run from responsibility, to run from expectations, to run from the things that scared you the most. She had spent years trying to outrun the weight of the ranch, the land, the legacy of her father's blacksmith shop. But it was always there, following her, no matter how fast she tried to go. "Maybe you don't need to run anymore," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe it's time to face it, whatever it is." Cole looked up at her then, his eyes meeting hers with a depth that made her heart skip a beat. For a moment the noise of the saloon faded away, and it felt like they were the only two people in the room. His gaze was intense, as if he were searching for something in her eyes, something he hadn't seen before. "Maybe you're right," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "but I'm not sure how to start." Gabriella felt a strange sense of understanding. She knew exactly how he felt. She had spent years trying to find her own way, trying to make sense of the life she had inherited and the future she was building. But sometimes, the hardest part was simply starting. "Sometimes," she said slowly, her words carefully chosen, "the hardest part is just taking that first step. Letting go of what you've been holding on to for so long." Cole nodded, his expression thoughtful. He seemed to consider her words for a long moment, the weight of her meaning sinking in. "And sometimes," Gabriella added, her voice quieter now, "you have to stop running long enough to let someone else in." The words hung between them, and she could see the shift in Cole's expression. It wasn't a dramatic change, but it was there, a flicker of something that hadn't been there before. A glimmer of something real, something they couldn't ignore. "You think so?" Cole asked, his voice softer now, almost hesitant. "I do," she replied, her voice steady. "I think we all need someone to remind us that we're not alone in this, that we don't have to carry it all by ourselves." Cole didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes searching hers, as if considering her words. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but the sincerity was unmistakable. "I think I've been running for so long I forgot what it felt like to be seen," he said, his voice low and raw. Gabriella felt her chest tighten at his words. She understood that feeling. She had felt invisible so many times, caught between the roles she played for everyone else and the person she longed to be. "Maybe it's time you stopped running, Cole," she said softly, her heart pounding in her chest. "Maybe it's time we both stopped." Quote. The air between them shifted, charged with something Gabriella couldn't name. It wasn't just the weight of the unspoken words that had passed between them. It was the quiet, unacknowledged truth that for the first time in a long time, they weren't alone in their burdens. They weren't the only ones who carried the weight of expectations, of responsibilities that could feel suffocating. Cole's eyes didn't leave hers, and for a moment, Gabriella wondered if he was seeing her in a way he hadn't before, like he understood the depth of her solitude, the strength she carried, and the cracks beneath it all. "I don't know what it is about you, Gabriella," Cole said, his voice low but steady, "but there's something about you that makes it hard to keep running. Makes me wonder if I've been running the wrong way all this time." Gabriella swallowed, her pulse quickening. The words felt like a confession, an admission that wasn't just about the land or the cattle or the past they had both been trying to outrun. It was something deeper, something they had both kept buried for too long. "I don't have the answers for you, Cole," she said softly, her voice quieter now, more vulnerable than she had ever allowed herself to be. "I've been trying to figure out my own life for so long, but I think I'm starting to understand that we don't have to figure everything out on our own. He nodded slowly, his gaze steady as he took a step closer to her. He was right. She was right. The unspoken truth between them was that they didn't have to carry these burdens alone. Not anymore. "I never thought I'd find someone who understood," he admitted, his words rough, but full of honesty. "Someone who could see through all the walls I've built." Gabriella's heart fluttered in her chest, her breath catching for just a moment. This wasn't the way she had imagined it. Not the way she had expected to feel. But standing there, in this quiet moment, with Cole in front of her, it felt like the beginning of something. Something neither of them had been ready for, but both needed. "You're not the only one who's built walls," Gabriella said, her voice barely a whisper. "I've spent my whole life building them, trying to keep the world out, but maybe it's time we started tearing them down." Cole's eyes softened, a flicker of something tender passing through them. "You sure you're ready for that?" Gabriella took a deep breath, her heart thundering in her chest. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew this. What they had was real. What they could build together could be real, too. She wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't afraid to take the first step into something unknown. "I think I'm ready," she said quietly, her voice steady, but filled with a certainty she hadn't felt in years. "Are you?" Cole's smile was slow, hesitant at first, as though testing the waters of something he wasn't sure would hold. But then it spread, a quiet, genuine grin that lit up his face. "Yeah," he said, his voice low, "I think I am." The saloon around them seemed to fade into the background as they stood there, looking at each other in the flickering lamplight. There was no need for more words. Not yet. But in that silence, in that shared look, they both knew that something had changed. Neither of them had been looking for this. They hadn't set out to meet in a place like this, to find something more than what the world expected of them. But life, as it often did, had a way of surprising them when they least expected it. And now, here they were, standing on the edge of something new, something that didn't need to be rushed or figured out right away. Gabriella took a slow, steadying breath and reached out, her hand finding Cole's. His fingers wrapped around hers, strong but gentle, a quiet promise between them. There was no need to say anything more. They had both already said everything that mattered. "Maybe we don't need to have all the answers," Gabriella said, her voice soft but filled with resolve. "Maybe we just need to be ready to see where this goes." Cole's grip tightened on her hand, his smile widening, his eyes bright with something Gabriella couldn't quite define. "I'm ready for that." Quote, they stood there for a long moment, just holding each other's gaze, the sounds of the saloon around them no longer mattering. The world outside, the valley, the ranch, everything they had left behind, seemed to fall away, leaving only the quiet understanding between them. And then, finally, Cole broke the silence. "I reckon we'll figure it out," he said, his voice low and steady. Together. Gabriella's heart beat just a little faster, but this time it was a feeling she welcomed. She wasn't alone anymore. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't running from anything. She was exactly where she needed to be. "We will," she agreed, her voice soft but certain. Together. And with that, they left the saloon, stepping out into the quiet night, ready to face whatever the world had in store for them. Together, no longer running, no longer alone.